have to remember, I'm doing this so my kids have something.
That's
Sure,
right.
that
Okay.
is right.
Got to remember.
Yes, this is what it's for.
This is a story that needs to be told.
Yeah,
We
and
don't
we're
have the storytellers as much as we used to.
and we're
Yes.
trying to do the oral traditions.
Yeah.
So
Well, you always wish you had that for your parents and your grandparents. It's
That's
like,
right.
why didn't we all talk about it? Why didn't we do it?
right. Judy, please give us a little bit of information about your background and your connection to Charlevoix and to Green Sky Hill.
Okay, some of my background is I was born and raised in Charlevoix, and I went to school here, and I did kindergarten right in this room.
That's wonderful.
It's nice to be back and see some of the stuff still here. I graduated from Charlevoix. I went on to the University of Michigan and got my bachelor's degree in nursing from there, and worked in the city of Flint and around, and then moved back here to end up as a school nurse here in Charlevoix as my retirement year, right before I retired. And so that's when I returned back to Green Sky Hill.
Okay.
That's my connection thus far. I've stayed there since I've been back from retirement.
Were you part of the membership of Green Sky Hill when you were here as a child?
Yes.
All right.
My grandmother, my grandparents were both part of the generation, probably third generation, maybe second generation of the people who moved here and started Green Sky Hill Church, where it stands now. So I'm a founder's generation
Yeah.
from Green Sky Hill.
That's wonderful. Well, let's get started. What is so special about the location of Green Sky Hill?
Well, it's a beautiful place to begin with. That's the best thing about it. But it has a real historical place in history. It was a meeting ground for a lot of tribes in Northwest Michigan, apparently from all over the country, as I've done some reading. Mm-hmm. But there's a set of trees out there. They weren't there when they were meeting. They only came there when the church started. But it's an historical place for Native American meetings.
That first got started, even
Right.
before the church was
Yes,
established.
yes.
All right.
Any idea how long?
I don't. I just know when Green Sky started, and the place was there, and the preacher that started Green Sky was aware of the meeting place. So he started in 1833.
Okay.
So it was easily, a generation before that. I'm sure if he knew about it, he was probably in his 30s or 40s when he came here.
Well, as I've visited it, it's up in the hills looking over Susan Lake,
Mm-hmm.
right off of Boyne City Road on Old 31 North.
Correct.
And there's a picture there in that book you have that shows the council trees, they're called. What's the story behind the council trees?
Well, the story behind the council trees, there's a couple of stories. Some of them are very
Okay.
romantic. Some of them are just the story itself that we know it. But I'm going to hold it
Yes,
up here so
please.
you can see. But the significance of the trees themselves is that they were crooked. They were bent to be crooked. The reason for that is where the story split. Some say it's because the chiefs that met there wanted to make sure that they were markers for the place. Others say that each family built one or planted one, and they wanted it recognized. They were bent to keep from the axemen who came and did lumbering. So they bent them so that they would not be used for lumber. But the legend goes that they didn't bend them, that they bent on their own as a sign that as long as the trees grew straight, there would always be peace in Michigan. And obviously, the tribes fought, the whites and Indians fought, and they grew crooked.
They grew
So
crooked.
that's just an old legend, though.
How did the church get started?
The church was started by Peter Green Sky, who was a Chippewa Indian. Most of us in this area are Ottawa Indians, but he was a Chippewa from the Brimley area, and he went to I don't think it was called seminary school back then, but preacher school, and became a minister. He traveled from the Sioux to Mackinac, met some Methodist ministers, some Presbyterian ministers. They sent him down to the Old Mission. Old Mission had Presbyterian churches, and Peter Doherty kind of took him under his wing, and then Peter Green Sky became a translator
Oh.
for Peter Doherty as he went around trying to mission to the natives.
Okay. So so it sounds like he started up in the UP.
He had his
and
training,
ended,
yes.
Yeah, training, and then ended all the way up down in the Leelanau Peninsula.
Right. Well, in Old Mission first, and then across to Northport.
Okay.
And that's where he was still just a translator when they sent him across there, but there were so many natives over there, and he became, acquainted with them, of course, that he had his own following there. But in one of the stories, one of the letters that Peter Doherty wrote to some friends, I understand that Peter Greensky's following worshipped in such a way that it was offensive to the white worshipers in the other churches, because I would say they were probably drumming and hollering, and it was all in praise of the Lord.
Right.
But
the method was different.
Right, the method was different, and Peter Greensky originally was a trained Methodist, and so he wanted to get out of the Presbyterian method anyway. But anyway, the Peter Doherty's group invited Peter Greensky and his followers to leave the church. And so
Okay. That's a very nice way to put
yes.
that.
So
Invited them to leave.
So they packed up all their belongings, got in canoes, and traveled the 17 miles from Northport to the channel here, to Charlevoix.
Okay.
Came through the channel, and they landed in Oyster Bay.
Okay.
It was called Pine Bay or some other name at the time. But then they traveled up to Greensky Hill. I think it's about a 2-mile hike.
It wouldn't be much more than
Right,
that.
and then, but most of the people took housing or built their houses around Susan Lake,
Okay.
but they worshipped right at the top of the hill at Greensky Hill.
Well, that's a wonderful story about the connection and how he got started. How long was he the pastor for the church? How long did his leadership go? Do you have any idea?
Well, he started the church they started worshiping in 1833. I was just reading where he did not get recognized by the Methodist as a real minister until 5 years later in 1830. And then apparently he had to, because he was a lay minister, he would get recognized, get ordination or licensing, I guess, every 5 years or so. So I think he died in, I'm going to say 1849, maybe in the 1850s, so maybe a 20-year span. But he did he didn't stay at Greensky. He traveled to other churches as minister there and then came back. And as he was gone, then we had other local natives just kind of step up to the pulpit.
Okay. Do you have any idea how large his following was at that time?
Well,
anything?
The understanding that the history that we have, the oral history we have, is that there were, including him and his brother and family, both their families, 27 other families came across on canoes, and they were the origin of Greensky Hill Church, and that's why we say there were originally 29 of these council trees that I showed you the picture of before. This is just a painting by Mrs. Sloop, who was a wife of a minister we had out there for several years. But it just she gave that back to the church for us to keep out there. It's just,
and each tree planted was supposed to represent those 27 families.
Yes.
Okay. Very nice. So just as a matter, 27 families came along with Peter Greensky to make the crossing to Charlevoix. How large were the families back at that time? Do you have any idea?
It would be a guess, and I would guess they were, 5 or 7 siblings. Probably some had as many as 10. I know of families, the generation before me, who had that many children. So it's possible they were big. I don't really have any figures on it. We just know the names of those who ended up in my generation as I grew up here.
Sure. So you could be talking about maybe 200 people who came in that first group.
Yeah, I think that's the numbers I did see at one point.
Okay.
Yes.
Interesting. Who were some of the significant native leaders of the church after Peter Greensky?
Some of the ministers after Peter Greensky were his brother Jacob, who followed him. And then after that, there were several others, lay speakers, who did each Sunday morning service. John Willis was one. Amos Kagi, who started a lay speaking school in the state of Michigan for all of us, and it continues to this day. Natives come together and learn about how to do some speaking in the church as a preacher or as a guest speaker, and do some work like that. But it's named after Amos Kagi, who was there in the 50s. And then my great uncle Andrew Wasequam was a preacher who came afterward. What I remember about him is that he did all of his messages in the language. So people who came to church for that particular Sunday, many of them left wondering, what did he say? But a lot of the natives really appreciated hearing the message in the Ojibwe language.
I would think so, because the language has to be heard in order to be understood and continued.
Yes.
So that's very interesting. How large was the congregation when you were growing up? About how many people were involved in the congregation?
When I was growing up there, as a young person, a real young person, there were probably 30 people, so 20 to 30, 30 to 40 differing Sundays. But it was mostly all native at that time in the late 40s, 50s, and up to the 60s. And then as in the 60s, then white people started coming, and Indians started intermarrying, and so their husbands would come in, and their kids, of course, and so that we became really quite an interracial church, as we are today.
Okay.
And now we probably have a total of 60, probably 30 or 40 in the morning and 25 to 35 in the evening worship services. One of the things about the church is the morning service is predominantly the major population, or the majority population, white people, with maybe 30-35% natives attending it. But our evening worship is predominantly Native American. So that's been really a nice blessing for those of us who don't like the 9 o'clock worship time.
It sounds like, well, I think it's a great idea.
Yes, well,
good for you for being progressive enough to think about, well, we don't always have to do things in the morning.
Right.
Maybe people would prefer the evening.
Right. That's what we thought. We like that. And it makes a difference because more young people come too at that time. They work all week long. They don't want to get up on Sunday morning and start their day off right at 9 o'clock again. Right. So it's been great.
Yeah, very good on your part for coming up with that idea. Let's start with showing us some of the pictures that you've brought. You have lots of things going on here. What's this painting right here? This is
an artist drawing of the council trees that have the crooks in them for directions or to keep the lumbermen's axe away. But this particular one was drawn by a minister's wife, and she donated it back to the church. I think it's just a lovely picture that we use. Did we talk about
No, let's talk about that.
The council trees?
Let's talk about the trees some more.
The council trees are they're really old, they're falling apart. We had 29 of them planted at one time, each representing a family who came across from the Leelanau Peninsula as the original founders of the church. And they planted them, and then as they grew, they got to be about, I think, 5 feet, and then they would take the lowest growing limb and bend it down and anchor it to the ground so that as it grew, it would have a crook in it. And then they would cut off either the main trunk or the next strongest tree so that this would become the strongest branch that grew. Thick. And that's why they're so thick now. So it really looks like the whole trunk of the tree is bent. But what a biologist came and told us was that they actually cut the main trunk off and bent down a large limb to make it crooked.
Okay, that's interesting. So it wasn't, because I had visions of the central core of the tree.
Well, that's what I always thought too, but this apparently was an arborist of some kind that claimed to know what he was talking about. So
it is something and what was the rationale for that originally, the stories behind that?
Well, originally, it was to keep the lumbermen from cutting the tree, because they didn't want crooked trees. They wanted nice straight trees. But one of the legends that we were told when we first started talking about the church was that the Indians planted the tree and made them, they didn't make them crooked, but they just said, we will all plant these trees together, and as long as they grow straight, we'll know that the white men have kept their treaties. And as it turns out, all of the trees are crooked. So, but that's a legend. And there were also some stories about it being the war between other tribes, so that as long as they go straight, there's peace between all of our tribes. Well, that didn't happen either. So another
it was a
legend.
good try, though.
Right.
A good attempt. And so, you talked about camp meeting at one point in time. Show us a picture of the
Oh,
one
yes.
of your camp meetings and tell us what that's about and what's in the importance for the community.
Well, this particular picture was taken in 1926, and it is of a gathering at Green Sky Hill Church in the summertime. And these people were not all of our church people. There are people that came from Canada, from downstate, from Illinois, from Wisconsin. A lot of people from Wisconsin came over here. And in the summertime, all of the Indian churches in Michigan, and there are 9 of them as Methodist, other denominations have them as well. But in Michigan, they gather in the summer and they travel from church to church to church to go to these camp meetings to catch up with all of the community that they've grown up with, all of their relatives whom they haven't seen maybe in the whole year. Back then, travel was not as accessible as it is now, and so these gatherings were really an important part of community. It was made for worship, and the worship went on for a week.
Wow.
We hear that some of the older generations say, I remember coming out to Green Sky and we would worship from noon until midnight. But obviously we couldn't take that now, and we're not tough like that anymore. But worship was the primary reason to gather, but just the fact of getting together with family really made this work. And we still do camp meetings. They're just 3 days now, and they're just 2 evenings and then a Sunday morning. One of the nice things about getting together with this is that back then you didn't see your family as often. Now we can drive any place and see them when we need to. But at the end of each camp meeting, there's a farewell circle where we gather and get in a circle, and everybody goes around singing a song, marching to Zion, shaking hands and greeting each person individually and saying what we need to say to them. Maybe it's just a handshake, maybe it's a hug, maybe it's a relative that is aging quickly and we have a chance to say goodbye and shake hands and hug. And for me, that was pretty significant when my great uncle Andrew died. The last year before he died, we were able to come to a camp meeting at Northport, and he was there, and we did the farewell circle, and I shook his hand and I said, I hope this is not our last greeting. But as it turned out, it was.
It sounds like it's a really wonderful tradition.
Yes.
Well, you've got some things going on now with refurbishing the church. Tell us about that a little bit. You've got to show us a picture of what the issues were.
Well, this picture, let me start with this picture.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
This is a picture of probably the generation of children that came over with the founders. They've grown into older people now, but they are at a work session here. This is 1896 is what's the documentation on this picture. And this is the original church form, and it looks, they're standing in front of the church here. I think they might be putting on the porch or putting on the bell tower, or they could be putting on the roof. I think the roof went on a little bit sooner than 1896, but I'm not sure. But this is what that picture is, they were sitting here, and it's without the roof. That's what that looks like. So I'm thinking maybe it was a roof, maybe not. But this church is historical because of the logs and the way it was built. And these were all huge timber, and they're dovetailed. They were hand-hewn and hauled from around the area.
You said the logs were squared off?
They're squared off. They were huge, 12 inches, probably 12 by 12. And I don't know how long the church is, but this is that structure is what makes us historical for the state of Michigan. We are a historical site for Michigan, and we're on the National Historic Register. So it's really important for us to maintain this. As it turns out, this particular part of the church has deteriorated considerably over the winter months of all of the years since 1833. And finally, we decided we really needed to do something. And this year, we were able to get a grant to replace some of the lower logs. They had to raise the church up to put new logs in, and then to structurally support the whole church across the bottom now. We were able to get a grant from the Grand Traverse Band of Ottawa and Chippewa Indians for $53,000. And then we had to come up with another $25,000, $26,000, which we were able to do over a matter of months. And so we are so thankful for all of the people who supported us, and especially the Grand Traverse Band.
That's pretty quick, really. Just being able
really
to get it together
is.
in
We
a couple
were
of
we were
months.
scared to death.
Yeah.
I mean, we were holding little tiny fundraisers, you know, that would bring in maybe $100, all the way up to one of our members' granddaughters wrote grants, and so she wrote several $2,000 grants, and then a lot of people just came forth, just blessed us tremendously.
Well, that's you had a story I thought about how originally, when it was built, the windows and doors were transported.
Oh yes, the windows and the doors, the wooden parts of those structures were transported from Traverse City by canoe. And this building was started in 1840, in the 1840s, and finished in the 1850s. And so canoe was their transportation. They put all this on canoes, traveled it up Lake Michigan, and up to Oyster Bay, and then Oyster Bay they unloaded it and hand carried it the remaining 2 miles up to the church. And so it's a pretty neat story of
can't
our
imagine
church.
transporting windows and doors that size on Lake Michigan.
Yeah.
I hope the weather was good.
Well, I'm sure they went port to port to port, because that couldn't be fast travel.
No, not at all. And you have another picture here. Tell us about that one, please.
This one is a picture of a gravesite, and it's on the original cemetery. We have, I would say, kind of 3 cemeteries, but we call them the old cemetery and the new cemetery. This is on the very top of the original cemetery, the old cemetery. And it is of a gravesite that is how they all used to be finished, with a fence around them. And this is a replacement of an original. And they used the fencing, and my belief is that they used it to protect the gravesite from animals digging up the bodies and using them as food, because they didn't bury them as deep as we do now, so that it was easy for animal to access it. But I believe that's why the original intent was to make the fence around it. This is the last one left of all of them, and this has been replaced now by a Girl Scout who's a granddaughter of a native Little Traverse Bay Band Indian, and she was getting her gold badge, her gold Girl Scout badge, which is equivalent of the Eagle Scout badge, and her project was to redo this, restore it to its original, and she did a marvelous job. And it's a beautiful sight to see. If you come to Green Sky, you can go up, follow the path up to the top, and it's the only one there. It's a beautiful thing to see. We are grateful to her for her energy to do that. Young people that got it all.
Right, exactly. And what are the leather signs that you brought?
Oh, these are just a reminder to me to talk about the kids' camps. This is from 1979. We had a camp before that, I think, in the early 70s. And then it went through the 70s to the 80s, and then we have a new one going on now. And we still call it Green Sky Hill Heritage Youth Camp or Youth Action Camp. But it helps us to keep the kids connected to Green Sky Hill. We teach language. We teach craft such as beadwork and basket making, and we interweave that with some of our religious beliefs. We try to, the theme of our current kids camps are Christ in culture and culture in Christ, so that there's the connection between. It used to be in probably the 1950s, 1940s, 50s, and 60s, there was a feeling that all of the Indian ways were pagan and we should have nothing to do with them anymore. Probably was even earlier than that, maybe the 20s and 30s. And so my grandmother was just she just would not have anything to do with anything like that, or so we thought. As it turns out, I think she did do some kinds of Indian drum songs in her bedroom.
Okay, I see.
But
it's okay if I do it in the privacy
right,
of my own
exactly.
space.
That's why it kind of helped me realize that these things were okay to do too. But we now incorporate a lot of our traditional native culture into our worship services. We do hand drumming, and especially at funerals, they allow the big drum to come into the church, and so the men are pounding, and it is really powerful for the families to have that there as they say goodbye to their loved ones.
Yeah.
And we do native language, and we sing in the language, and then we do Grandmother Moon ceremonies 4 times a year at the change of the seasons.
And tell me, Grandmother Moon, I'm not familiar with that.
It's a ceremony for women, because we believe that, you know, the moon kind of guides us, as you know, with all of the fluid, the body, the water. And so we have a Grandmother Moon to celebrate her and to give thanks. And so we gather together, all ages of women only, and it's a cleansing, actually. It's supposed to be a cleansing ceremony where we cleanse our hearts and cleanse our minds, try to take away things that are negative in our bodies, and by talking and by thinking and by praying. And then we go out, we have a fire, we do a talking circle so people can share what they feel, and you can join in if you want to, you don't have to, but we pass a stick and everybody has a chance to talk. And it goes around 2 or 3 times. It's quite emotional on sometimes, because some people are really, this is something they need to talk to other women. So we do a talking circle, and we go outside and have a fire, and we give thanks to the Creator for the gifts that Grandmother Moon has given us. And then we have a feast, of course.
That's a great way to, and well, it sounds like a wonderful ritual,
Yes.
really important, and a good way to help draw a community in, and perhaps to help keep young people involved as well.
Yes.
Well,
it's wonderful because it incorporates our native culture with our Christian culture. It's important to us now.
And you had mentioned that you felt there was good support from the Methodist Church to allow to be supportive of that, not so much allow, but be just
right. Well, and it is actually allowed, because I think they were the ones who, a long time ago, said, no, when you become Methodist, you give up your Indian ways. But it's my belief that those people who became Christians were not dumb. They knew what they were doing. Sometimes Indians think, oh, you can't be taking those white man's religion. You have your own religion. But I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think our ancestors of Green Sky Hill knew what they were doing. They took it on in complete knowledge that this is what they believe.
Okay.
And I
something
think
they embraced wholly.
Yes, with knowledge, not just overwhelmed, thrown at them.
Right, or
but
being brainwashed.
Yes, but there are some things that I think were put on them that they didn't probably need to have put on them, and one of them is taking away the drumming and taking away the language. So it's good that the Methodists are now saying, oh, I'm sorry, we shouldn't have done that.
Yeah, okay, that is very good to hear. I had a story that came into the library about a black person, a black man in the black community in 1870s, and that Green Sky Hill was somehow involved in that. What do you know about that story?
Well, I know not much, but I have heard some stories. One was that the story that you know of a black man traveling in Michigan, killed by some Southern people. I don't know that that's true. The story I heard was that this gentleman was a working man here. He was traveling to pick up somebody, I think, in the Traverse City area. Okay. He got lost and somehow wandered onto a farmer's property who shot him. And then what transpired after that was that nobody would take care of the body because they didn't know him as far down as he was. I think he was someplace in the Ellsworth, Eastport, Atwood, Traverse City area. Okay. And so they called up to this area saying, do you know him? Can someone come get him? And finally they got in touch with Green Sky Hill Church, and the members there said, yes, we'll take him. And he went down and got him, brought him back and buried him at Green Sky Hill.
Okay. Well, there was another part of that came into the library about this paper was quote from a letter that a woman had written about when she'd been burned out. She was another part of the Black community that had been at Boyne Falls, and when she'd been burned out, the Native community from Green Sky Hills, she mentions directly in a letter to her sister-in-law about how they gave her fish, they brought her food, and were very helpful in her situation of dire need. And lots of folks were burned out at that time.
Yes.
So they are today. Well, what do you see and hope for the future of Green Sky Hill? What is your hope for the?
Well, I hope we stay an active community church. I hope. I hope everybody can get on board with children's programs, with language, with all of the traditional Native intermingling with Christian faith. I would like it not to become a museum. I would like it to stay an active outreach for people. I think we can do that because we have young people coming to our church now. I think we've been blessed with lots of children. We've been blessed with young people coming, and we have the working people we have a huge amount of that age group coming who call themselves members of our church, but they're spread so far and wide, and they're spread so thin that we don't often see them. But I'm hoping that as they age, they will say, "Oh, I need to come back and help this church stay alive."
Yeah. It's hard to find time when both members of the family are out working full time to support a church group like this. Was there a time when someone in the Charlevoix community wanted to try to make a museum?
Yes. Well, I think somebody was wanting a museum, and somebody said, "Well, you don't need a museum. You just need to go out and look at Green Sky Hill Church. There's your museum." And or we can build one out there because there's such history out there. And then somebody else wrote and said, "No, this should never be a museum. This is an active place of worship. This is a place to get help. This is a place where people work and share and live. It should not ever be a museum." So while we would like to keep historical documents and a few pictures and things like that, we're mostly about helping people, we hope.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Judy, for joining us today. It's really been a pleasure to have you here and tell us some real interesting facts about a very important part of our community.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.